Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be invited to speak at the Royal Society. I think if my physics professor in college knew that I was talking about Pierre Simon Laplace and mathematics in the heart of the Royal Society, the dynamo of his grave could be used to power most of London. But here I am, and here we are. And I think it's quite interesting to think about this sort of topic I'm going to be lecturing on today. One way of beginning is to begin in Cornwall, at the very tip of Cornwall in 1852, when a sailor, not a sailor, a local person, basically found a piece of wood on it, just a few feet long, that had on the words, Mary Somerville. And this, in fact, was the sad remains of the ship, the Mary Somerville, which had launched in 1834, had sailed on the China trade and to India for the next couple of decades, and then had met its final fate in a terrible accident off the rocky coast of Cornwall. Now, I think this kind of symbolizes in many ways the kind of problem we face with Mary Somerville. With any historical figure, in fact. We're dealing with traces, we're dealing with a famous name, we're dealing with somebody that in some ways we see around occasionally. I mean, Mary Somerville is very well known in certain respects today. She is, for example, famous as one of the really few notable women in science who actually published in the Royal Society Transactions, was involved in very abstruse mathematical works, wrote works for very wide audiences, like The Connection of the Physical Sciences and a book on geography in the 1840s. She went on to write an autobiography and a book about science under the microscope. She was, in many ways, and remains a very important figure in the history of women's rights. She was the first person to sign the petition asking for women to get the vote in the later 19th century. She was somebody who supported John Stuart Mill's views on the education of women, and in many ways she herself was a shining example of what a woman could accomplish under great difficulties. The Pursuit of Knowledge Under Difficulties, Female Examples, which was a book of the early 19th century, could, if it had been published in a later 19th century edition, and such books in fact often did, feature Mary Somerville as important examples. But let's think about this kind of reputation a little bit more. I just wanted to show you, this is the ship, the Mary Somerville. Now, one of the things I was very surprised when I started working on this subject was that the main story everybody knew about this ship was that it sunk on its maiden voyage. 1834, it went out, and it disappeared never to return. This is, in fact, what Mary Somerville says in her personal recollections. She was a very old woman at the time, and clearly she just forgot, because, in fact, she was given a special gift when it returned, courtesy of the H.M.S. Mary Somerville, and there it was. In fact, if you look closely at the ship, it's even more interesting for us today, because you'll see here on the prow of the ship is the figure, in fact, of Mary Somerville on the very front. And that figure on the prow is, in fact, a copy of the bust of Mary Somerville that you have here at the Royal Society. And this is one of the primary representations of Mary Somerville, a famous bust by Chantry. You can see how these kinds of images of Mary Somerville circulated from the heart of the Royal Society, where she represents something very fundamental as a statement about how women are part of the work of the Royal Society, even in the 19th century, when they aren't allowed to be fellows. And, on the other hand, she's part of this great imperial set of explorations in the 19th century, part of the great China trade, part of what made Britain a great maritime empire. What I really want to argue and suggest in the paper and talking to you today about Mary Somerville is that even if you've never heard of her, there's a whole variety of different ways of thinking about her. And I think one of the things that makes her particularly important to think with is that it's not just that she's an example, as the Victorians would have put it, of the pursuit of knowledge under difficulties, female examples, but she's something much larger than that. She's something that can tell us about science generally in the 19th century, the relations of science to all sorts of other activities, particularly in relationship to empire, in relationship to what science means, and particularly what the role of the scientist is. All of these questions are ones that the case of Mary Somerville is really helpful for thinking with and through. Now, to understand this, I think what we need to do is to go, first of all, and understand her early life, because I think that's one of the ways of getting through and thinking about where she's coming from and what she's doing. She comes, in fact, from a very well-known Scottish family, from Bruntisland in the Scottish lowlands. Her father was William George Fairfax, who was captain of the H.M.S. Venerable at the time of the Battle of Camperdown during the Napoleonic Wars. And in fact, he was very heavily decorated for his work in the military. And in fact, also, he died in the very late 18th century when Mary, who had been born in 1780, was just a young girl of 17. I think this family position is really important to remember because for a long time, in fact, the bust of Mary Somerville here had a small piece of label on it that said basically Lady Mary Somerville. Now, she would have, in fact, loved to be called Lady Mary Somerville, but she was not a lady. She was not part of the aristocracy. She was, in fact, high gentry. But her status really did matter to her. She was very much a lady. And she thought very, in terms of her overall status. She didn't actually belong to the aristocracy, but she was certainly, when ladies and gentlemen would associate, she very much belonged to that sort of circle. And I think understanding that is quite important to understanding how she was able to participate in science and the sort of way that she actually participated in it. I think the other thing that's important to remember is that basically she came from quite a conservative family. This was a Tory family in a part of the Britain that was quite conservative at this time, dominated by rather dour Presbyterianism. And I think one of the fascinating things about her early life is how she breaks away from this early kind of situation in a period that has really very little to do with the Victorian period. We're talking now about somebody who's born in 1780. So we're talking about somebody whose main formation is in the late Georgian period and very much part of that sort of world. I think it's important to recognize, if you look at her basic formation and the way that what she was expected to do, is that the chief issue in her early life was that she was supposed to marry. This is, of course, the age of Jane Austen, and finding a suitable husband for a young daughter was a very important kind of thing to do. Especially it's true because the family has no fortune for her. She's not going to be getting any money. So she's not any kind of heiress or anything like that. What she really has, and this is quite an important theme in her life, is that she's quite an attractive woman. This is a portrait from the 1820s, but it does actually, and it's currently in Somerville College in Oxford, but it gives an idea of the fact that she was actually considered to be quite a catch in terms of her physical appearance. And this was quite an important issue for her in her early life. One of the things I think we can see when we look at this background that she's in and where she's coming from is that she initially becomes interested in mathematics through the very kinds of things that you might think would lead her away from these sorts of subjects. And in particular, she first learns what algebra is by looking in a fashion magazine. Now, this may seem really quite strange to us today. Probably the most scientific most women's magazines get today, at least the ones I tend to look at, are the astrology columns in the back. But that in the 18th century, and particularly in the earlier 18th century, this wasn't the case. There were magazines like The Lady's Diary, for example, which were largely circulated and run for women that posed problems, mathematical problems of various sorts that could be answered and dealt with. And she became very interested in this. And this is really around the time her father died that she became interested in this problem of what was mathematics and how to answer these kinds of questions. So she becomes familiar gradually with some of these circles that are involved in various aspects of mathematics. It also, I think, ties into this involvement in these mathematical puzzles and problems in these magazines to a wider network. Because these weren't just things you did on your own, like a Sudoku puzzle or something. They were actually something where you would write in your solutions to people, say, at Woolwich Military Academy or other people that were running and editing the journals. And we can see this particularly if we look at her earliest mentor, John Playfair. John Playfair was a professor of mathematics and astronomy at the University of Edinburgh, very eminent writer, and particularly well known for his important series of reviews in the Quarterly Edinburgh Review, one of the main places of commentary about public issues in science. He had very strong views on the need for women to be well educated, He was a Whig, a liberal in contemporary terms, and very much wanted to encourage these sorts of ideas. So unlike her own family in many ways, she was beginning to move into a world which was much more oriented to questions of rationality, to order, and to questions particularly that would give women a sort of place in the sun here. But there were obviously issues around some of this. In particular, her first husband was, when she finally did find a husband who was willing to marry, was a man named Greig. And Greig himself was involved in Russian diplomacy. He had a position in London around these kinds of questions. But in fact, it was quite unfortunate because in many ways he discouraged her from any kind of female learning. And so it was really quite a difficult sort of situation. It was, for Mary Somerville at least, a great tragedy when he died, but it was also, of course, a great opportunity. And in the middle of the decade of the 18 teens rather, she began to take a much more active position and began to look for another suitor. Because not only had William Greig been not very supportive of female learning, he had in fact had a fortune. And so his fortune descended onto Mary Somerville, and suddenly she was in this much more attractive kind of position of being able to pick and choose among the many suitors which now came to her family's home in Scotland, where she had returned. Now, I think one thing to recognize about Mary Somerville during this period was that she was now able really to participate in these kinds of circles much more actively. And we can see it in particular in when I was editing Mary Somerville's works, was really, mostly I was just republishing works in facsimile, so it was very simple. It wasn't real editing. But the one thing I did find, which I was really happy to do, was to identify both the periodical that she contributed to and also the problem that she won a prize for. In 1811, she contributed to the New Mathematical Repository, an answer to a Diophantine problem in 3 variables. And you can see here it's anonymous, a first solution by a lady. There aren't any other people who use this pseudonym in the journal. There are 3 or 4 problems under this title. And most interestingly, this particular solution, there's a manuscript copy in the Somerville papers at Oxford, which even by rather conservative editing standards would indicate that it's her that's actually doing this work. So what I think we can see is the kind of thing she's actually doing. She's participating in these networks. She's encouraged by John Playfair. She's very much in some ways, it's an outgrowth of her actual military upbringing as the daughter of someone who's a captain in the Navy, because basically she's able to join in with circles, many of which have military connections. And like I said, at Woolwich Academy, other places. This periodical is quite an interesting one. In fact, it turns out John Stuart Mill's first publication is actually in this periodical as well. He was quite a boy wonder, of course, and he did it, I think he's about 7 or 8 when he answers one of these questions. And it's quite nice. She actually gets a medal for doing this solution to the problem. This is very, very important for her in terms of the winning this prize. So here she is, a young widow, having published this answer in the Mathematical Repository. And here you can see it. It's actually given for merit, and then the mythological symbols on the right there. It's a standard stamped-out medal, but she was clearly very proud of it, and it's now in the collections of Somerville College in Oxford. So I think one of the things to understand then is that Mary Somerville, even by the time she's mid-late 20s, is quite a well-formed person in terms of her scientific interests, and particularly her interest in mathematics. That's where her central kind of issues arise. That's what she's most about. And it's very interesting, when she does actually find a suitable husband, it's someone who has a strong interest in science. The man's name is Dr. William Somerville. He had been an African traveler and had a big manuscript that he was hoping to publish about his travels among the Khoikhoi, or the Bushmen in South Africa. And he's really interested in this sort of work and very supportive of the kind of work that his wife is doing, and to quite an unusual degree. In fact, one of the most touching things about their relationship is that they're more or less his wedding present to her is a small library of French mathematical books. Lagrange, Laplace, all the others are on the shelf. And in fact, those are now in the library of Girton College in Cambridge, very much the idea of supporting the idea that girls should go in and do this kind of mathematical work. But for Mary Somerville, she recalled at the end of her life what a huge pleasure it gave her to be surrounded by this little library, the very best works in French mathematical analysis. Now, I have to tell you that it would be nice, from my point of view, if there were dozens of women around the country who were buying little libraries of French mathematical works and getting them as wedding presents. Perhaps some of you actually, maybe if you're fellows of the Royal Society, did get a set of mathematical books as a wedding present. In fact, I got a copy of the Dictionary of Scientific Biography with my wife, which we were always very thrilled to have. But I think that those kind of things tend to be rather unusual. It certainly was unusual during this period. And in fact, there's a famous story that the only person that could really understand certain mathematical works, there were only two women in England who could understand certain mathematical works. One of them was Mrs. Greig and one was Mrs. Somerville. And of course, then the poor French people who had mentioned this learned out that they were the same person, which is, of course, frustrating. So I think it's interesting to think about, why is Mary Somerville so interested in mathematics? What does it do for her? What kind of thing is it? Well, I think there's several issues about it here that are really important. I think probably the fundamental issue here is effectively a theological one. Mathematics for her is a form of theological engagement. It's a way of thinking about the divine great laws that tie together the universe. What makes the universe work the way it does? What gives us our position in the universe? Ultimately, those laws are mathematical. And the sense of losing herself in mathematics, of working through these very complicated mathematical works for herself, working out these kinds of mathematical puzzles and so forth, these for her are really fundamental to how she defines herself. And I'm just going to read you a little passage from her book, The Connection of Physical Sciences, published in 1834, that outlines a little bit of this. These formulae, emblematic of omniscience, condense into a few symbols the immutable laws of the universe. This mighty instrument of human power itself originates in the primitive constitution of the human mind and rests upon a few fundamental axioms which have eternally existed in him who implanted them in the breast of man when he created him after his own image. Now, this is, of course, a very common theme among mathematicians and physicists of the 19th century, and in fact, going right up to today. Maxwell talked about it, for example, when he talked about the way in which molecules were actually present in the heaven and in the kind of way that they are on Earth. And that common measure between heaven and earth gives us a kind of standard by which we can even evaluate human morality. For Mary Somerville, these kinds of questions are really important. So from the point that she had learned about algebra as a young girl in a fashion magazine, it was this divine spark underlying these kind of abstruse mathematical formulas that were really important. One of the things I think also that's quite interesting about Mary Somerville's engagement with mathematics is that in many ways it led her in her whole development through these kinds of this journey that I've been describing, is that it led her to views which in contemporary religious terms could be viewed as heresy. This is very clear by the time she reaches London, and this is just after her first husband's died, but basically this is a letter that she wrote to one of her theological mentors. I attended the established church, but with little satisfaction, shocked by their creeds and stuck with the litany addressed almost exclusively to our Savior. I don't believe in the Trinity at all, but I imagine our Savior to be sent by the one God to instruct us in his will. Now I cannot tell whether he was really a mere man or if he existed before he came into the world. So ultimately she became secretly a Unitarian, and publicly she went to the established church. But she had to be very careful about her underlying religious beliefs and how they would actually be interpreted. So behind a facade of apparent conformity, you can see just how this interest in mathematics and interest in science could potentially, not always, but in her particular case, lead her very far away from the rather conservative, staid origins that she had come from. And by the 1820s, she's really in the heart of the London scientific establishment. And this, I think, in many ways, is for her the happiest and most exciting period of her life in the 1820s. She's really only published these problems in mathematics at this point, but she's right at the heart of what's going on in London science during this period. She associates with other people who are in Royal Society circles, people like the discoverer of platinum, William Wollaston, or the geologist, Roderick Murchison, but not just with men, but also with their wives. And they meet in parties, they collect minerals at home, they make astronomical observations outside. It's a kind of whole world for them that they enjoy and are part of. And I think it's also important to say it's not just a dilettante or amateurish world. One of the things I think that's very important to recognize about Mary Somerville's background and kind of where she's coming to all these issues from is that this division between amateurs and professionals doesn't really exist in the early 19th century. And in particular, the stress on publication is quite different than it is now. Mary Somerville had only published these anonymous papers as a lady, and yet she was actually a central part of the London scientific scene. It was as much who you talked to, the conversational world that you were engaged with, and the kind of ways that people acted within that then publishing, printed papers. Printed papers were important for certain types of issues, but they weren't the end-all and be-all of all forms of scientific activity. And I think living in the period we do right now, when the internet is changing the role of publication, it's easy to imagine, at least, how there could be a different form of science in which these more informal kind of contexts, where you go to Paris and talk to the learned people there, you go to their lectures, you meet them. That kind of exchange was one that was really quite an open and important form for making science itself. I think it's particularly important in the case of someone like Mary Somerville, because the 1820s, in that sense, are the last great flowering of a period in which there's real opportunities for women within the sciences, within these kinds of activities. It begins to become more focused on publication, more focused on professional roles for scientists, and that really comes from the 1830s and after. So we're in a period of transition, but there's definitely a role for someone like Mary Somerville within this world. I think one thing also to stress, though, is that she did want to, as part of her whole plan in many ways from an early age, to show that women could properly engage in science, she did want to show that she could make original published contributions to science. And that's best illustrated by the paper she publishes in the Philosophical Transactions in 1826. This is just from the reprint I did of it, but you can see here it's a standard Royal Society paper. It says read. All papers at the Royal Society at this point were not read by their authors. They were read by the secretary, who would read them out to the assembled fellows. And then, believe it or not, there was no discussion at all afterwards. I mean, the meetings must have just been incredibly boring, to be honest. But I don't know. They seem to have had the patience to deal with that sort of thing. It was very much a sense of, this is for the record. Now, it's important to say this about the way the paper was handled, because Mary Somerville herself was not at the Royal Society when the paper was given. She wasn't in the audience. She certainly couldn't become a fellow because it was an all-male institution. It was a club, basically. It was like the Athenaeum or all the other clubs, and these were male clubs in this period. And I think it's important to recognize also, though, that for someone in Mary Somerville's position, who very much saw herself as a lady of good family, she had no real desire to push her way into the Royal Society and actually give a lecture or to perform in the sort of way I'm performing right now. It's just not the kind of thing someone in her position would do. So there were certain kinds of places where she'd be quite open and animated about her interest in science. But in fact, even in private conversation, strangers often found her surprisingly demure and rather dull, almost like, someone who was just an ordinary little, person who knitted all the time or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with knitting, actually. But I think that the real issue here is that for someone like Mary Somerville, it's a question of the right kind of actions in the right sort of places, what's appropriate to certain kinds of things. And for making an original discovery, as she was claiming to make here, publication was the right way. And this was an attempt to show that she could make an original contribution to science. Now, the thing that was rather tragic, in fact, was that this paper turned out to be wrong. basically. It was part of the general discussions in the wake of Ørsted's work on the relationship between magnetism and electricity to show that all forces could actually be related. And Mary Somerville was working on the relationship of sunlight and issues about their relationship to magnetism, particularly. Now, I'm not going to go into the reasons why the results proved not to be wrong. What is interesting, of course, is at the time it was published and by the referees and everything, it was all seen to be a perfectly fine contribution. It added to the debate. It went on. It was translated into French and German. It enters into the regular part of the scientific discussion. But for Mary Somerville, this was actually a huge tragedy. And immediately when she found out that her results were no longer trustworthy, she burned all her private, separate copies of the paper. She really did not want this paper to actually exist. And later on in her life, the memory of this episode really burned in her own memory. She says here, "In the climax of my great success, the approbation of some of the first scientific men of the age and of the public in general, I was highly gratified, but much less elated than might have been expected. For although I had recorded," and this is talking about some of her later work, "I had recorded in a clear point of view some of the most refined and difficult mathematical processes and astronomical discoveries, I was conscious that I had made no discovery myself, that I had no originality. I have perseverance and intelligence, but no genius. That spark from heaven is not granted to the sex. We're of the earth, earthy. Whether higher powers may be allotted to us in another state of existence, God knows. Original genius in science, at least, is hopeless in this." Now, this passage, which I find quite difficult, actually, is, I think, something that she wasn't sure about. Even in her autobiography, which was left in manuscript for her daughter to edit, the last part of it is actually crossed out. When the autobiography was published, it wasn't included at all. And the reason for that, I think, is quite simple, that it would have been quite a blow to the women's movement to have something like this stated in this balder form. I think the way it's described in some of the secondary literature on Mary Somerville is about right, and that is that she had to come to terms with the fact that she had failed in certain things, that not everything had worked out. And I think this is a thought she has sometimes about the kind of work she's doing. I don't think it's the ultimate kind of basic way that she thinks about it, and particularly the idea that women could never make a discovery, I think, is one, like I say, that she did cross out. But I think it does show the power of these kind of conventions about genius, about discovery, about publication, and how difficult that placed someone even as skilled and able and committed as Mary Somerville was in this kind of world that she's living in. So I think we need to understand that kind of position. So what kind of work was Mary Somerville actually doing, and in particular in the years after this paper actually had been proved to have serious problems? Well, as I said, she was very engaged with French mathematics, and the greatest work of the age, of course, was this one, the treatise on celestial mechanics by Pierre Simon Laplace. This was a work of the late 18th century. Effectively, it completed Newton's system of the world and showed that there wasn't actually any need for any outside forces at all. It was a complete, self-sustaining, clockwork-like system. Newton's mechanisms are not clockwork-like. He requires interventions at certain points. This Laplacian system shows that mechanics can explain the whole thing. But of course, given Mary Somerville's theological beliefs, that was actually perfect because it showed that mathematics was a way in to understanding the way that God actually operated. Now, this was a highly abstruse mathematical work involving the most refined mathematical techniques that had developed by the French in the 18th century. It was certainly not a work that was widely appreciated or understood in the English-speaking world, although people respected it. There were really a handful of people who could read and understand a work like this at this period. Now, what is quite interesting is that she was approached in 1828 to provide a popular redaction of this work. This is a representation of, effectively, the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. an organization developed in the mid-1820s to make knowledge more accessible to large numbers of people. And you can see here this printing press on the left has all the symbols of modern science along with it, including my favorite bit, which is University College on the top of the person's head. There's phrenology, there are balloons, there's the broom, which we'll see in a moment, represents the Lord Chancellor, Lord Henry Brougham, sweeping away all the old knowledge, all the old kind of dusty bits, and bringing in these new useful chemistry, physics, other subjects which are supposed to help us to understand the natural world. The idea was that, and this is the man who had the idea, Lord Henry Brougham, Brougham basically thought, let's make it so that people can understand Newton's Principia and especially Laplace's work on celestial mechanics. And let's make it so that ordinary working people, mechanics, can actually understand. There was no calculus, no background in the subject at all. Now, there was a lot of space to do this. The works were very tightly printed, and they could be up to 800 pages long, so there was plenty of space. But of course, there was a fundamental flaw at the heart of the whole enterprise, in that basically the degree of mathematical knowledge that was needed to understand anything but the most general outline of the theory would take a whole treatise or several treatises in itself to explain, and they were certainly not in the understanding of the ordinary person. So in many ways, it was a rather contradictory and difficult request. But Mary Somerville sat down to begin to work on this almost immediately. And the result, I think, was quite a satisfying one in many ways. She finished the first half of the work, and she showed it, first of all, to Henry Brougham in the previous picture. Brougham, however, immediately saw that the work was much too technical for anything that was suitable for his series. And so finally, then it was published by John Murray, who, of course, had his offices nearby here on Albemarle Street. John Murray was a very generous and interested publisher. He was very much part of these London scientific circles in the 1820s. And he basically saw here an opportunity both to help out some of his friends — he was particularly close with William Somerville — but also to make it so that there'd be a kind of representation of the important work that the English could actually do in this area, and particularly that the work could actually be done by a woman. And so here we see the title page of the final result. A big, fat volume published with lots of mathematical formulae, very difficult to set and print. And most interestingly, you can see it's actually listed here as being The Mechanism of the Heavens by Mrs. Somerville. So immediately people will understand that this is a work by a woman. So it's a very important symbolic statement of what can be done. It's in some ways the culminating moment for that whole tradition of ladies' diary, mathematical repository, prize competitions, and kind of autodidact mathematics in the early 19th century. What Mary Somerville does is to take Laplace, which, if you've ever been through it, is very difficult to follow. There's a lot of assumptions about what you need to do to get from one step of the proof to the next, and it's also all written entirely in without any use of geometry. Mary Somerville puts much more of it into a three-dimensional, understandable versions of geometry and tries to explain each step. And so it's in some sense, it's half a translation and half a kind of guide to the way that you can understand these issues. So this work is published to great acclaim, but to very few sales. And one of the little mysteries I have is why the book actually was selling terribly, and then suddenly all 750 copies seemed to disappear. My suspicion, in fact, is that it's getting to be quite an embarrassment that it's not selling at all, and something happens to those copies, that they're actually bought out or pulped or something, and no one really... I haven't ever quite been able to figure that out. The important thing to recognize, though, is that the real triumph of this book was not necessarily in terms of increasing understanding of Laplace in Britain. In fact, I don't even really think it was very heavily used as a textbook anywhere or something. It wasn't it was too advanced to be part of any kind of course. It's a symbolic work in terms of representing what the pursuit of knowledge can represent, and particularly what the role of women can actually be in this work. And it's not surprising that it's immediately after this work that Francis Chantry's commissioned to produce the bust, which is actually currently in the Royal Society here. Now, one of the things I think that's very interesting about the work, which is hardly ever mentioned, is that this is just volume 1. And that, in fact, if you go to the archive in Oxford, there's volume 2 as well. But that is in manuscript. And what happened was, even though the first volume had sold out, that second volume, is never published. And I think, to my mind, this is one of the great turning points in Mary Somerville's career. And it's quite an important moment within the whole history of understanding how the problems that anyone publishing in these kinds of fields would have. There are a couple of reasons why it wasn't published. I think one of them is certainly that there had been a full-scale English translation done in the United States by Nathaniel Bowditch just around the time that this one actually appeared. So there was kind of, from a publishing point of view, this looked a bit redundant. But the other thing is that the second volume was, in some sense, unlikely to sell any better than I really think the first probably had. And it wouldn't have made much of a profit. And the symbolic value of course, really had been more or less exhausted with the first volume. And so, although she takes the second volume to John Murray, and he shows it around to people and so forth, it does not appear in the public sphere. And for her, I think this is one of the great turning points in her life. What she really decides at this point is that she's not going to be able to continue to publish in mathematics. She actually writes another mathematical book that isn't published either. And so she starts to think, well, the best thing for me to do is to start to focus on what was effectively the preface to the Mechanism of the Heavens, which was a work which actually talked about the range of sciences, in that case mostly astronomy, and looked at how you could understand them without mathematics, but in a sense of what their underlying consequences were. This is a very common kind of work around 1830, around the kind of time of the Reform Bill, where the notion of what science was, who should practice it, how the different disciplines were related and so forth was being much discussed. This is the period that saw John Herschel's famous book on the preliminary discourse to the study of natural philosophy, or another very important work, Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. All of these were works that were for a general audience as well as a specialist one, explaining the principles of the sciences and how they actually operated. And so Mary Somerville turns to what becomes one of the most important and significant of these reflective works on science. They're not really works of popular science. They're much more reflective than that. And it's this book here, The Connection of the Physical Sciences. Now, this is just a small note, but this is a copy here that I actually got from a bookseller in Australia. I'm very pleased with it because, as you can see at the top, it says, "To the Lord Chancellor," from the author. The Lord Chancellor, in fact, is Lord Henry Brougham. And so Brougham is, in fact, the guy who turned down the Mechanism of the Heavens, and hence that's why John Murray had to publish it. So it's got quite a nice little history behind it. I should also say that two-thirds of this book were uncut when I got it. But I think that's partly because he had already read it in manuscript. At least that's if you're generous. So I think we can see a bit, this sets the pattern for Mary Somerville's later life and career. She writes these more reflective works about the sciences, viewing them from above, thinking about their relations, how they can be understood, how they can be put together. What I want to do in really the final part of the talk is to look at how these kinds of works placed Mary Somerville and her writings right at the center of what it meant to practice science during the 19th century. She is, by the middle of the 1830s, effectively an icon for science. There's ways in which you can see all sorts of ways in which her basic career, the kind of issues she's involved in, the sort of questions she's actually tackling, are very much part of this general concern with sciences, reflecting on it, thinking about what it actually represents. She's very much somebody, like I said, who adopts this rather quiet persona in private. Much of her later life, in fact, she's living in Naples and in other parts of Italy, partly to save money because the family, they had bad investments, and so she's had to withdraw from some of this London society that she so much loved. But I think underlying a lot of her works are central ideas to understanding 19th century science about progress and civilization. I think if we think about what science meant to her, science, and particularly mathematical science, were the epitome of what civilization actually was. They were the highest accomplishments that human beings could actually accomplish, and she needed and wanted her readers to understand how this actually operated. She sees the kind of science, she sees science as part of this general idea of civilization and what it can provide for us. And these works come across especially in a work like physical geography. Here you can see her portrait by now she's quite an old woman. This is published in 1848, and so she's 68 at the time this is published. And you can see now that it doesn't have illustrations, mainly because it's tied into one of the great atlases of the period, and it says, look to Humboldt's physical atlas, which will help you to understand the kind of physical phenomena I'm showing. But in a work like this, she's really arguing for a way of understanding the connectedness of all different geographical areas. There's a lot of reflections on geographical distribution. She's not an evolutionist. She doesn't believe that progress is caused by some sort of transmutation or process of material transformism. I think there are complicated reasons why she thinks that. It's not that she has some fundamental religious objection to it. It's more that I think she thinks that the sort of way that the world operates is much more, there's kind of a relationship where effectively all matter has the possibility of organic life within it, and that needs to be actualized. And so it's not really, I think she sees Darwinism as effectively too materialistic in a certain kind of sense. I think one of the important things to recognize about the way that these works work, and you can see it in that picture as well, is that there's a very important sense that science is the highest point of human accomplishment, but it's also specifically a European accomplishment. And it goes along with a racial idea about how human accomplishment should actually operate. Like many liberal Victorians, she believes that there is actually a hierarchy of races, with Europeans on the top and the Bushmen and Aborigines and so forth at the bottom. It's not that she's kind of a raving racist or something. Those aren't very useful terms for thinking about this period. But she does believe that there's this kind of hierarchy, and that civilization and mathematics are at the very top of that kind of point of view. And I think it's very important within her own thinking about this that her own aesthetics are very important. She actually is very aware, as I said, of her own attractiveness and physical attractiveness. She actually talks in physical geography in the following way. She says that feminine beauty has a relationship to wider issues of progress. The Circassian race, and that's, of course, the one she belongs to, the white race, has extended throughout most of Europe and India and much of North Africa and the transplanted peoples of the New World. These nations are remarkable for a beautifully shaped small head, regular features, fine hair, and symmetrical form. Civilization, in that sense, is closely associated with beauty. The most savage people, she argues, are also the ugliest. Would that it were so easy. I think it's very interesting also, she drew on her husband's knowledge of racial developments. Her husband had traveled in South Africa, had actually done studies of sexual characteristics of the Khoikhoi. There's actually a paper unpublished in the Royal Society here, or at least the drawings are unpublished, which he really was trying to answer quite fundamental questions about the sexual characteristics of the women of the tribe. And she was very aware of these sorts of issues. She doesn't discuss them in the book, of course, which is intended for a general audience, but it was the kind of thing that, she felt very much in touch with current exploration, current kinds of geographical work. And it's interesting, if you look at a book like the Physical Geography, you can see that she actually, in the book itself, becomes a real manual for empire in the later 19th century. By its later editions, and it goes through many different editions, it's doubled in size, and it's actually being used at Oxford and other places as a textbook for people who are going out to be missionaries or travelers or government agents. Parts of it are actually summarized and extracted and published in India as manuals for the Pandits about geography. So there's very much a way in which she's very much the leading edge of empire. And I think this is something that goes right back to her earliest works. Even something like the mechanism of the heavens is very much part of the kind of broader question of geodesic surveying and the shape of the earth debates and other sorts of issues. She's very interested in these kind of questions, and they are, of course, fundamentally important to things like the Indian survey and training engineers and so forth. So she's very much part of that kind of practical world of empire in the 19th century. So I think when we think about Mary Somerville, we're actually thinking about a situation which moves with the 19th century. By the late 19th century, of course, attitudes toward empire are hardening. In some ways, I think in ways that she didn't fully agree with. She very much thought that there was this hierarchy, but she regretted the fact that the lower races, as she would describe them, were going to become extinct. She thinks it's more or less inevitable. That's a very common view. Darwin holds it, for example. But she regrets that that's actually the case. And I think she also regrets the fact that human beings are gaining so much power over the earth that they're in danger of actually destroying some of the most beautiful and wonderful creatures and aspects of the natural world that we live in. There's quite a remarkable passage in one of the later editions of the Geography where she reflects on this very question. We may hope, she says, moreover, that with the increase of wealth, leisure, knowledge, and refinement, which happily seems a secure prospect for long vistas of the future, man will endeavor to preserve the equilibrium which exists in the meteorological forces and vital conditions of countries, when in their natural state, by fostering a due proportion of woodland, and thus save from extinction the myriad beauteous forms of life which have shared with him the inheritance of this wonderful earth. So I think what we can see here is attitudes in some ways which are very much typified by this famous painting of American progress. You can see here the female symbol of learning, the Bible, in fact, in her hand, the telegraph, the modern, the Pony Express, the new carriages, all moving in. And on the other hand, the old dark forces, the buffalo, the Native American, so forth, disappearing. I think the thing about Mary Somerville is, of course, she may have even been, you can imagine her a bit as the woman in the center of all of this. In symbolic terms, it's quite a kind of, there's an interesting relationship between the fact of her iconography being so important and women like this depicted as allegorical figures. She becomes almost an allegorical figure in her own right. But I think the real issue here is that she would have regretted much of what was happening in this kind of picture. She saw this kind of extinction, this loss of natural habitat, and as she says, the loss of the beautiful creatures of the wonderful earth as being something to be regretted. So I just want to conclude by saying that I think, and I hope that what I've said encourages you to think both about Mary Somerville, who is somebody who we can really, and sometimes look up to. I've always really admired her, even from the first time I ever heard of her and I saw her bust here in the Royal Society. But ultimately, I think that's the same kind of attitude, in many ways a rather condescending attitude, that people like John Herschel and her other friends, in fact, in London had, which was that she was a unique specimen, a kind of case of female learning that we could kind of watch and think about, but in some sense not part of the hurly-burly and sometimes even ugly aspects of 19th century society. The real Mary Somerville is much more interesting in that. And I think in many ways that the thing that really sums it up for me is that it's around the figure of Mary Somerville. It was in a review of one of Mary Somerville's books, The Connection of the Physical Sciences, that the term scientist was actually invented for the first time. Now, it didn't become used in this country for a long time, until the 1880s and 90s. Most people don't call themselves scientists. But the fact that the word itself comes into being and is thought about as a possibility, that William Whewell, the Cambridge philosopher, thinks it's necessary to think through that kind of problem in relationship to Somerville, shows that she raises precisely the kinds of questions about who can pursue science, what science is for, what the role of creativity and genius is in science, how do we publish in science, and how does that relate to the other kind of activities that we have to engage in. She raises all those sorts of questions. In her own context, she raises, of course, these huge questions about empire and race and the position of women in society. And I think thinking through those kind of questions with her helps us to understand her as a really fascinating insight into our own position with regard to the modern sciences. Thanks.